What if the universe only becomes real the moment you look at it? That sounds like something from a dream, but it's actually a serious scientific argument that some of the smartest physicists in history spent their careers defending and arguing about, because they couldn't even agree with each other on what was happening. The wild part isn't that they believed it. The wild part is that the math almost forces you toward it. Because when you write down the equation that describes a particle, it doesn't tell you where the particle is. It gives you a probability map for what you'd find if you measured it. And only when you do measure does one answer actually appear. So, what does that equation actually look like when you write it out? When you write down the equation that describes an electron, it doesn't give you a location. It gives you a list of every place that electron could possibly be, all at the same time, each one weighted by how likely it is to show up if you look. That's not a simplification. That's what the equation actually says. Before quantum mechanics, physicists pictured particles like tiny marbles. A marble sits somewhere specific, even when you're not looking at it. And if you know where it started and how fast it's moving, you can calculate exactly where it'll be later. The math was clean, and Bohr would later argue it was more than clean. Those classical concepts like position and momentum aren't just convenient. They're built into the structure of ordinary language itself, the preconditions you need before you can communicate anything to anyone about an experiment at all. Then, the experiments started coming back wrong. When physicists fired electrons one at a time through a barrier with two narrow slits, the electrons didn't pile up in two neat lines on the back wall, the way marbles would. They built up a striped wave pattern, the kind you'd get if two waves were overlapping and canceling each other out in spots. Each electron, fired alone, with nothing else going through the slits, somehow produced interference. And this is where it gets strange in a specific way. The marble picture didn't just fail to fit. The electron's properties, like which path it took, where it was going, turned out to be genuinely ill-defined, unless you could point to a specific experimental outcome that produced them. Bohr would say a phenomenon isn't just the particle doing something. It's the particle plus the entire experimental arrangement that detected it. The wave function came out of the attempt to make sense of this. It's a mathematical object that describes not where a particle is, but where a particle might be. And that word might isn't doing the same job it does in everyday life. When you say, I might leave my keys on the counter, you mean you don't know where they are, but they're definitely somewhere. The wave function doesn't work like that. It treats all the possible locations as genuinely coexisting up until the moment something measures the particle. A physicist named Max Born worked out what the wave function's numbers actually tell you. If you take the amplitude of the wave function at any given location and square it, you get the probability of finding the particle there when you measure. That's the whole job of the wave function. It draws you a probability map. Nothing in it tells you which outcome will actually happen. Most people's first instinct is to push back and say the particle must be somewhere. We just don't know where. That instinct is natural, and it's also what the experiments rule out. When physicists design tests to check whether particles secretly carry definite hidden values before you measure them, the results kept coming back the same way. The particle and the measuring device don't stay separate. They form a kind of inseparable whole, and the classical idea that an object has its own fixed attributes sitting there, waiting to be discovered, stops making sense in that situation. So superposition isn't physicists admitting they're confused. It's a description the math forces on you. And the person who pushed hardest on what that even means spent most of his career doing something that looked, on the surface, less like physics and more like a very careful argument about words. Bohr's answer to all of this was to stop asking what the electron really is and start asking what we can actually say about it. And that confuses a lot of people who expect physicists to argue about equations. But once you understand why he kept doing it, the Copenhagen Interpretation stops sounding like a dodge and starts sounding like a very careful answer to a genuinely hard problem. When quantum mechanics was still new, everyone wanted to know what the wave function was actually a picture of. Was it a real physical wave spreading through space? Some kind of field? Two different versions of the math, one from Heisenberg and one from Schrödinger, gave identical predictions, so they had to be describing the same thing. But nobody could agree on what that thing looked like, and that disagreement wasn't just academic. It went right to the heart of what the theory meant. Bohr's answer was that everyone was asking the wrong question. You can't describe what an electron is doing between measurements, because the concepts you'd need to use, things like position, speed, momentum, were all built up from watching large objects move around in everyday life. We invented those words by looking at rocks and planets and water, not by probing things too small to ever see directly. There's no reason to expect them to automatically apply to something you can only access through instruments. This is what Bohr called complementarity. Take the wave description of an electron and the particle description. Both seem to work, but in different experiments, and they can't both apply at the same time. Bohr eventually put this in a sharper way. You can describe a quantum event in terms of where something is in space and time, or you can describe it in terms of cause and effect, momentum and energy, but not both at once. Each description is mutually exclusive, and yet together they exhaust everything you can possibly know about the object. Neither one alone is the full picture, and there's no third option that combines them. So the electron doesn't carry a fixed nature that you're uncovering when you measure it. The setup is part of what decides which properties are even meaningful to talk about. And Bohr was clear that this has nothing to do with the observer's mind. He wasn't saying that a conscious person causes something to happen by looking. He was saying the results of any experiment have to be expressed in plain, everyday language so they can be communicated to other people. And that's just a basic requirement of doing science at all. The detector clicked. The particle landed here. The needle moved to this position. You can't report a result in quantum terms because nobody could read it. The wave function itself, Bohr pointed out, involves imaginary numbers, quantities that don't have a direct counterpart in anything you can point to or draw. It's a symbolic tool, not a photograph of something sitting out in space. It encodes what you can expect to find given a specific experimental setup. And if you change the setup, you've changed what the wave function is even talking about. So Bohr wasn't dodging anything when he refused to say what the electron really is between measurements. Our classical concepts were built for a world we can touch, and there's no guarantee they reach into a domain we can only poke at indirectly. Schrödinger understood all of this perfectly, and he hated it. So he built a thought experiment designed to show exactly how absurd it gets when you try to apply that logic to something you can actually see. The experiment he built for that argument is one of the most famous in the history of science, even though it was never meant to be run. Schrödinger helped write the equations that quantum mechanics runs on, and then spent years trying to convince people those same equations couldn't be the whole story. The cat wasn't a celebration of how weird quantum mechanics is. It was an argument that something had gone badly wrong, and specifically that the Copenhagen view was asking people to accept a blurred model as a genuine description of reality. The way you might mistake a shaky photograph for a picture of actual clouds. By the mid-1930s, the Copenhagen Interpretation had settled in as the standard way physicists talked about all of this. The wave function describes a superposition. Measurement collapses it to one outcome, and you're not supposed to ask what the particle was doing in between. Schrödinger found this deeply unsatisfying, so he built a scenario designed to make that dissatisfaction impossible to brush off. Picture a cat in a sealed box. Inside the box, there's a single radioactive atom, a Geiger counter wired to a relay, a small hammer, and a flask of hydrocyanic acid. If the atom decays, the counter discharges the relay. The relay releases the hammer. The hammer shatters the flask, and the cat dies. If the atom doesn't decay, the cat lives. The atom's decay is a quantum event, which means before you open the box, quantum mechanics says the atom sits in a superposition of decayed and not decayed at the same time. Now here's the part Schrödinger actually cared about. If the wave function describes reality, and the atom is genuinely in superposition, then the cat, connected to the atom through that whole chain of physical mechanisms, should also be in superposition. The wave function of the entire system would have to carry both cat alive and cat dead as coexisting components. That's not a stretch or an exaggeration. It's what you get when you apply the math consistently to the whole setup. Schrödinger wasn't saying, "Look how strange quantum mechanics is." He was saying, "This result is absurd." And the fact that the equations produce it tells you something is missing from the theory. A cat isn't an electron, and we know perfectly well that cats are either alive or dead. The superposition should have stopped somewhere before it climbed all the way up to something you could pet. Bohr's response cut the problem off earlier than most people realize. He'd argue the cat's fate isn't decided when you open the box. It's decided the moment the Geiger counter fires, because that's where an irreversible recording gets made. An amplification of the quantum event into a permanent classical outcome. The human observer opening the lid doesn't collapse anything. The collapse, or whatever you want to call it, already happened deep inside the mechanism. A lot of physicists found that answer frustrating because it left a real question sitting there unanswered. Where exactly does the quantum description stop and the classical one start? Is there a physical boundary somewhere? Or is the line just drawn wherever it's convenient for the calculation? That's the measurement problem. And Copenhagen doesn't solve it so much as step around it. You can't say the wave function describes reality for electrons and then quietly stop applying it once things get big enough to see. Either the superposition runs all the way up, which seems absurd, or something physically ends it before it gets there. And it turns out there's a real physical process that does exactly that, and it kicks in long before anything with fur gets involved. That process is called decoherence, and it's worth understanding on its own terms before you decide what it does and doesn't solve. Every real object bigger than an atom sits inside an environment that's constantly interacting with it. Air molecules bounce off it. Photons hit it. Vibrations pass through it. Electromagnetic fields brush against it. Each one of those interactions is a quantum interaction. And when a particle in superposition interacts with even one other particle, the two become entangled and their quantum states get linked together. Once that entanglement spreads across enough particles in the surrounding environment, something starts to break down. The interference between the superposed states, which is exactly what makes quantum behavior quantum in the first place, gets scrambled across so many particles that it becomes impossible to detect. What you're left with isn't a superposition anymore. It's what physicists call a classical-like statistical mixture, a set of stable, well-defined states called pointer states, the ones that survive the constant battering of the environment without getting scrambled. The environment is effectively running a measurement on the system the whole time, and it never stops. For large objects, this doesn't happen slowly. Something the size of a dust particle sitting in normal air decoheres so fast that the superposition is gone before any instrument you could build would have time to catch it. For a cat, maintaining a coherent superposition isn't just hard to arrange. It's physically out of reach because the environment tears it apart faster than any quantum effect could hold it together. So the cat never actually reaches a superposition. The quantum event at the atomic scale decoheres into something that looks classical long before the chain of mechanisms gets anywhere near a living animal. The line between quantum and classical behavior isn't drawn arbitrarily by whoever's doing the calculation. It's set by how fast environmental interactions destroy the interference that makes superposition visible in the first place. That's a genuinely powerful answer to Schrödinger's scenario, and it explains why you never see quantum weirdness in daily life. But decoherence only solves part of the problem. It tells you why you can't observe the interference between cat alive and cat dead. It doesn't tell you why you end up with one of those outcomes instead of the other. After decoherence, the math still contains both branches. They just stop interacting with each other. The measurement problem doesn't disappear. Decoherence makes the superposition look classical very quickly, but it doesn't pick a winner. For that, you need either some additional physical process that actually forces one outcome to happen, or a completely different way of reading what the wave function means. Many Worlds says both outcomes actually happen, and the universe literally branches into two versions, one where the cat lived and one where it didn't, with decoherence being what separates those branches. Bohmian mechanics takes a different route, saying particles always have definite positions, and a real physical pilot wave guides them. So the randomness is a feature of our limited knowledge, not of nature itself. Cubism goes further and says the wave function isn't a description of the world at all. It's an agent's degrees of belief, a betting strategy for setting expectations before a measurement, which makes it a form of participatory realism rather than a map of anything sitting out there. And there's a recent wrinkle worth adding. Using quantum error correction sensors, physicists have been able to detect a buildup before a quantum jump actually occurs, which suggests electrons might carry some memory of past states rather than jumping by pure chance. None of this has rewritten the equations, but it does suggest the line between random and determined in quantum mechanics isn't quite as clean as it looked. None of these interpretations have been ruled out by experiment because they all reproduce the same predictions. What they disagree on is something the math alone can't settle, and that's the part that still keeps physicists up at night. So here's where that leaves us. The same equations that make your phone's GPS accurate also refuse to tell you where a particle is until you measure it, and that's not an incomplete theory waiting to be fixed. That's what the theory actually says. Bohr believed atoms were real. He just thought our way of talking about them might be the thing that's limited, not the atoms themselves. So the world is real, but our language for it might only reach so far. And that's the strange place quantum mechanics drops you. Our math is precise enough to predict how a star radiates heat, but we still don't know what an atom is actually doing when nobody's looking.